vision. You don't really see the path too far in front of you, but it's been an interesting ride, yeah.
And these two wonderful artists have curated the exhibition, What Are You Looking At? And it's a really amazing show if you haven't seen it, but we're very privileged now to have a little conversation this morning about the exhibition. Let's start off with, how did this come about?
That's a pretty good one.
Yes, you could both have a shot at that.
Well, I think that looking back at the coming year and where we're at now, we're putting together an exhibition that helps celebrate Pilchuck's 50th, coming up on our 20th, and some of the relationships that we've had there. So we began this residency program in 2004. I think it was the official start of the joint residency between Pilchuck and the Museum of Glass. So this, coming into this early part of 2020, it was being discussed, and I think that both Ben and I were asked to look at what we've accumulated here over the years and see what we could come up with in terms of an exhibition to celebrate this great relationship.
Yeah, and I think in looking at the pieces in the collection, there's extraordinary diversity from this. I mean, to be honest, Ben and I could have put together like 8 shows from the list of artists that have taken part in this joint residency. Just amazing diversity of approach to the material. So that was probably the hardest part, honestly, was just narrowing down what we wanted to represent in this show. And then looking at the collection pieces, we felt like they're amazing in isolation, but if we could provide the words of the artists and the sort of some examples of what their greater practice is, either before they arrive here at Pilchuck in the museum, or where the experiments they've done here that are represented in the collection move from there and get incorporated into their body of work. That was something I know Ben is really interested in, because these people come in for a week, and similarly up at Pilchuck, they have this brief but incredibly rich explosion of ideas, and it's always a curiosity. The really great ones send you pictures, a few months, sometimes years down the road with the glass that they've made and how it's sort of found its way into their work. So I think we were both really interested in representing that and giving the artists voice to speak about I should say the residency here has a great, amazing collection of just brief artist videos, which are featured in the show, of the artists explaining for themselves what they're trying to do. And I always feel like that, the closer you can get to the source, the more accurate information you're going to get. So I was really intrigued with incorporating those into the show.
And the other thing I was thinking about actually this morning was kind of exactly that. I was like, oh wait, we could have used this work. Well, we could have used more space. I think we could have probably filled the entire gallery. And for me, being here for this length of time, this was actually something that I've always, at different points was on the forefront of my mind or on the back part of my mind, is just always to see an exhibition that showed the artist's work who have come here and what they've worked on. So this is really, for me, kind of, dream come true, some along those lines. But we could really, super pleased with how it turned out.
Yeah, and I know that one of the most frequently asked questions in the hot shop is, how did the piece turn out? How was it used? So I think you've really done a wonderful job of demonstrating that in this selection of items for our visitors. You touched on this a little bit, but there's been so many artists through our program, Ben, and it must have been very difficult to make a selection of artists and into a manageable amount of space. So I'm wondering, for both of you, what criteria did you use to make this initial selection?
Sure. Again, kind of leafing through the pages and pages of images of work from our collection, we sort of kind of made, cursory notes on like, okay, maybe this would work, maybe this would work. And then I think, as always, we're drawn. I think it's pretty evident when you walk through the exhibition. You can see the lines that both Ben and I are drawn to, in terms of the quality of the work or what it's about, or we have similar vision in that way. So I think that I looked at a draft list, made my notes, and then Ben looked at a draft list, made his notes, and then we kind of compared them, and they looked pretty good, and they were pretty close together. So I don't know. I think it was a hard thing to do. I think that we looked for what's new and exciting. We looked for emerging artists. We looked for established artists to sort of show the breadth of what this program offers and who's participated. I think that was a big part of it. Yeah, I'm sure there's more.
Yeah, I think there's some really strong themes that run through the show, but in some ways those emerged sort of secondarily for us. We knew it would be in the work, but in identifying artists we were interested in working in, there's certainly themes of like, how is technology beginning to interact with the handmade? There's a number of pieces that examine that. There's a certain, like, my early influences are like Pee Wee Herman and Jim Henson, so there's like a full-on sort of like surrealist, sort of like playful humor. I also like adult humor, which is present in both of those examples in spades, so, Megan Stilge's work. I think, if you look at the amazing show by Lisa Young in the front gallery, there's a really nice juxtaposition of ways to set up shows and ways for people to move through shows, and she has very clearly set out some themes in a way that it's very easy to learn, things about art and art making and principles from. And we really wanted to take a little bit different approach in the way the show is set up and organized, and make those connections not less obvious, but self-generative for the audience, because there's so many different connections. You could group 3 or 4 artists in different ways: fashion, furniture, the way they approach installation. But you could say installation, but you have Jess Julius's piece across from the De La Torres, and they couldn't be further afield aesthetically. So then you could also group the De La Torres with Tom Moore's work around the corner, because they have a similar aesthetic but totally different approach. So we tried to leave it really wide open, which can be challenging for an audience. But when we took the docents through, I said, frustration is just getting sore from learning. There is, there might be some confusion, or maybe I said confusion. Confusion is getting, so it's sort of generative in that way, hopefully.
I'll say I've adopted that saying. Somebody was speaking with me the other day about that specifically. He said, I'm kind of confused about this. I'm like, well, it's just a sign of being sore from learning. And I think I don't know that.
I don't think I've trademarked it, so you can.
Yeah.
Well, I do think that it has a strong playfulness about the selection of the artwork. And if you stand in there and look at everything, you see the groupings, the narration that is happening, the commentary on social justice, perhaps, very strong theme in the exhibition. And also the inclusion of new technologies, I think, is very interesting as well. And you've also touched on this a little bit, but thinking about the evolution of the artists in the show over time, obviously the resolution of the actual pieces came about through experimentation. And I know you both have used that word a lot in how you've described the exhibition. So what role does that take in an artist? Why is that so important to take those chances and risks?
Well, I mean, in some ways that, the obvious answer is that's how artists grow. But it's also, I mean, if you look at the role of these residencies that both Pilchuck and the Museum of Glass provide, they provide different opportunities to experiment. There's nowhere in the world that you can go and work with a team that has the skill set and experience of doing this that Ben and his team have here in the museum, or maybe, it's very rare opportunity for artists. So it provides, resources and techniques, particularly in this material that we all know has a pretty big learning curve for artists, both from glass and not. I mean,
Right.
to really try something different, and there's all these economic pressures on doing the same thing, or doing the thing that sold last week. So these residencies where they're not sort of bearing the cost of experimentation are really critical. And then Pilchuck's a little bit different. They have, a wide open, so there are opportunities to experiment across the different approaches to glass in a way that isn't always available here, and that this is kind of a hot shop oriented program. So what seems to work best is if they can sort of come up to Pilchuck for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and really have this like introduction to the material, so that when they come here and have the resources that they have at the museum, they sort of they've already gone through a little bit of the learning curve and can come to Ben and his team with sort of more feasible projects, or just more sort of like that they don't have to deal with the like, can glass do this as much if they've sort of had a few weeks of playing.
Do you want to add to that, Ben? Anything?
That's pretty good. But I mean, I'd echo a lot of the same. I think there's times where we always thought it a bit funny to sort of build a collection based around experimentation, but in this case, it's really a marker in time of an artist's journey and their path and their career. So it's actually a beautiful thing in a way. Not many people at this point in our history, when visiting artists come through and they're asked to donate a piece to the collection, they're pretty. I think we have enough of a reputation at this point that the work will get shown, so they're pretty conscious of what they donate, and it ends up being most times a stellar work, or a stellar example of the experimentation or the direction they're trying to go, and that part is just, I mean, it's really, again, it's just a nice mile marker that we have here to look at how somebody may have investigated a certain idea and continued down that path or gone a completely different direction. And I mean, that's a really important part of museums, but the Museum of Glass's sort of role in that history.
Yeah, I think as you were talking, both of you, I was thinking back to the early times here at the Museum of Glass, because I actually started here in 2001.
I was going to say, were you on the original committee that I interviewed with?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I
Yeah.
was. Because this is a very unique museum, the whole idea of bringing items into your collection that were experimental and not completely resolved was actually quite controversial at the time, and we had many discussions about that. But I think this exhibition really vindicates our courage in doing that, Ben.
Absolutely. I remember some of those conversations floating around, and again, that was at a time where I wasn't probably privy to that, and it's happening in curatorial for the most part. So, but I do remember sort of the controversy surrounding it, and it being definitely a conversation for sure.
Yeah, so there we are. I want to circle back, Ben, and talk a little bit about your comment about video, because here at the Museum of Glass, and we have Sam from AV filming this. We film everything. And fortunately, over the years, we have accumulated a pretty substantial, when you think about it now, 20 years of archival footage, and the choice to include some of that footage in the show as educational material and also artwork in itself is very interesting. How do you think that the video content really elucidates or informs the understanding of the piece for the visitor?
Well, I think in the most direct sense, you have artists talking about the art they make, and I think wherever you have an opportunity to interject that, I mean, art is a mystery for most of the public, and we have to keep remembering that because we're so immersed in this ecosystem that talks about art and thinks about art, and so as a curator, I'm always careful about the assumptions that I make. Well, that's obvious that was made that way or that way because I've been working with glass for 20 years, and it's hard to unlearn that and sort of step back and be a little naive. But in my impression, like the videos are really exceptional because they're not speaking in art terms about it. You know, what are you trying to do here? What is this piece going to be a part of? And for the most part, they're just very direct, the way artists talk to each other in the studio instead of how they might talk on a stage or something, you know. So I really appreciate them for that. They're videos that when I'm researching artists that I may not be familiar with, I go to Museum of Glass's video and I get a snippet. You know, it's not the extent of my research, but it's a really good introduction to artists. I think outside of the show, all of that video, it, like just what I said, it's available to curators, it's available to people that are curious. The live stream was always fun to like just check in and see what Ben and the crew are doing. It's something we're trying to wrap our head around. We've been videotaping everything at Pilchuck since the mid '70s. You know, since video was. Video. Very few people know the first couple of years at Pilchuck there was a very active video and sound element to the that Buster Simpson was largely in charge of, and because of that, it's probably one of the best documented experiments of that era. You know, I don't think too many people were obsessively documenting what they were doing in the woods, for better or for worse, back then. So we have that, but it's really, you kind of got to come up to Pilchuck to see it at this moment. So we're trying to wrap our head around. You know, I think the Museum of Glass, the most of the content that is produced here is really available, and I think that's wonderful. And we're trying to. It's quite an archive to work from, but we're trying to get to a point where that would be as accessible, because I think it's a huge resource for our field. We have artist talks, demonstrations, technical demonstrations, basically. Anything of note that happened on campus in the last 50 or 40 odd years is on there somewhere.
I think it's totally remarkable. We saw some of that footage last night, and it's just so delightful and just really wonderful. Yes, and I think both here and Pilchuck, these are great resources for the whole community.
Just to add to that, and very recently, I got a phone call from a dear friend, Boyd Sagiki, who's actually teaching over in Toyama. So my phone rang. Caller ID says Boyd. I'm like, well, that's weird. He's calling from Japan. Answer the phone, and Boyd's like, hey, you know, I don't want to take too much of your time. I'm like, Boyd, how you doing? You know, trying to check in and whatnot. And he's like, hey, we have an artist who's coming to the school next week, and she wants to do this. And she's been watching this video from the museum of this artist doing these powder pickups. He's like, I think it's Chandra McLean. I was like, oh, yeah. He's like, how'd you do that? What do I need to do? You know, and, you know, there was some technical talk, and Boyd is an amazing technician and glassmaker and such a kind soul. And so, you know, he's somebody who I always looked up to in the glass world. And so to get this phone call, you know, and he has an artist who actually is, so this is many times removed at this point, presumably Japanese artist who went through, probably came to our website, looked at a video and said, this is kind of the approach that I want to take, and I have this time in the Toyama faculty that I want to work on something along these lines. And it kind of comes full circle to show just how important those videos are and can be for as a resource for artists, for curators, for galleries, and the general public.
And this is not a new thing. I mean, we tend to think of like this obsessive videotaping, but I learned how to blow glass from VHS tapes that were pirated from Pilchuck and passed around and copied, and it was like fifth generation, like terrible, fuzzy, couldn't see anything, but we were trying to see how Dante made that Avoglio or whatever. I mean, that's literally, we were in Appalachian Center for Craft, like there was nowhere we could travel and see that stuff, but somebody had a VHS that they got from somebody that got from somebody. So the network, thank God, has built up a little bit. It's a little easier to access this stuff, but that's nothing new. That open source element of the studio glass movement in the U.S. is the reason it has evolved so quickly, and that the people graduating from college now have an assumed set of skills that would have put them at the top of the game 30 years ago. You know?
Yeah.
And that's because of it's all so available, you know, and it's amazing. There's also limitations, you know. You can't capture what it's like to be a pill chuck on a video. No matter, I mean, they do a great job. You see those like aerial shots, and I, you know, start tearing up and stuff. So they can pull at that, but it's very much built around a sense of place and being in the forest and how different it is to make in that place. So I do think there's a rush towards, you know, obviously with the pandemic, towards moving as much of this sort of learning and programming online. And I think that that's awesome because it's going to make more resources available for people. But I also think we need to recognize the limitations that like actual conversations have a richness that Zoom meetings don't. That, you know, face-to-face interactions are really important for humans and for learning, and especially when you're trying to learn how to do things with your hands, I think. You know.
The energy and the energy and the buzz that's created at Pilchuck, and I've been lucky enough to be there in many different capacities over the years, teaching and working, and just after day 3 and things start to gel and conversations happen, there's a buzz that happens up there. And you have to be immersed in it and be a part of it to really experience it.
Yes, actually, you've been touching on another one of my questions, and you've already discussed this there quite eloquently in a very different perspectives. I mean, we are a museum, you are a school, and there's obviously some difference in the residency experiences. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, a little bit more? Elaborate?
Yeah.
I'll let Ben take a swing at that since he's so involved with the residency.
Well, I think that what Ben talked about earlier, it's really great if an artist who's going to come down here like starts at Pilchuck in an ideal world, because they get exposed to all the different ways and manners of working in glass. So they'll be in flat shop, fusing glass, casting glass, and they kind of get little pockets, maybe a half day each day in sort of a different area. And sometimes they focus in on something a little bit more. Maybe an artist wants to work more in the hot shop and spends more time there. Maybe they really latched on to, the print shop and hanging out down there and making prints and exploring that. But there's a plan, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a plan that's sort of laid out for them in how they step into it, but then that changes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's structure with flexibility, or choose your own adventure, however you want to say it. But yeah, they also critically have a glass translator with them, somebody we call an artist assistant. It's probably one of the most critical roles on campus. So it's sort of their go-to glass. We look for people who have worked in all different areas of glassworking, from casting to blowing to, so that they don't funnel the artist's ideas into what they know, but what's possible on campus. And I mean, that is make or break for a lot of those artist residencies, because they need a translator. They're speaking art and we're speaking glass, and it's sort of like, okay, how do we make these things meet? So we have a smaller team. We have 2 dedicated glass blowers up there who are phenomenal craftspeople of their own right. But that team changes every couple weeks, so I will say that they don't produce on a level that the team here does. I mean, I've had the benefit of having one of these residencies here at the museum, and like you better come in and hit the ground running, because these guys are like, okay, we're gonna have a meeting, and then we're out there. And for me, I was like relatively kind of a younger artist. It was, I think, the first time anyone had made something for me, so it was just to actually have a different perspective, literally a different perspective on the work that was being made, because they were sitting I mean, it was a little unsettling as a glassblower. I'm like, okay, what do anybody need coffee? Like, these guys are such pros. But then as soon as if you get rid of the ego and everything and be like, wow, this team can do so much that I can't do, or can't even think about, that, I think probably, Ben can probably speak to this, the residencies, what are they, 5 days? Or
Yeah, about 5 days, yes.
I'm sure everything gets bigger and more complicated. You know, they're like, oh, they can do that? Oh, they can do that? Okay, you know, and then their eyes get big. I mean, I certainly see that at Pilchuck. There's a sort of trajectory where, you know, they come in, they're not sure what they want to do, they figure out the potential of the space, and they get totally greedy. You know, they're like, oh, I'm going to do everything, I'm going to make everything, I'm going to work my artist assistant in the ground. And then almost all of them come to a realization that's like, okay, I'm in this place. It's not all about just like cranking work, and they like really get into an experimental. But I've seen almost every artist in residence go through some version of that trajectory, you know, no matter who they are.
So having that experience prior to coming down here is super important, because they come off this wave and they're like, well, geez, I really want to focus in on this one thing and kind of move through that idea. And sometimes it's to their detriment, sometimes not. We do ask for folks to come down here prepared with sort of a list of ideas, okay? So you go, you know, don't come with one thing that you're really dependent on, because we might just burn through it. So, you know, there's typically like between 2 and 10 ideas, and sometimes we're able to get 2 or 3 done. Sometimes we're able to get a bunch of things done, and it really depends on the complexity of what they're looking to do. So Pilchuck's a great introduction to be able to help narrow that down. And if it goes the opposite way, I'm wondering if we could go back and figure it out, because if we have an artist who's going to come here and they're like, wow, these guys did all this stuff, they made this thing, it was giant, and then they come to Pilchuck and they're like, yeah, we're going to make this stuff and we're going to make it giant, we're going to put it everywhere. So I wonder if they come here first and then go to Pilchuck with the expectation of like, yeah, let's go. I got
change that trajectory. Yeah, I'm not sure. For better or for worse, we'll see. Yeah, I mean, I'm always down to experiment. I think that's critical. Somebody, I think it was Anna Mozowski in one of the videos last night, just emphasized the importance that Pilchuck is, or appreciation that Pilchuck is still evolving. And, you know, I think for me, from my perspective, once it stops being an experiment, it's dead, right? It was an experiment. It is an experiment. There is a ton of nostalgia for everybody who attended it at one certain point in its evolution, and it's never that when they come back, you know. But hopefully, it's always better or different, or you know. So this year was actually a tremendous opportunity within, you know, the sort of devastating impact of this pandemic. It was tough on all of our institutions, but it was also an opportunity to very quickly and sort of like immediately, but to try a different program that was built entirely around residencies. We had no students this summer. Challenging for an organization, you know, but we saw last night that those efforts and that continued evolution are appreciated by the artists who donated all of that work, you know, and Pilchuck, you know, the sort of tagline is artists supporting artists, and that really is its origin and continues to be its, you know, its support network, you know.
Yeah, and that brings up another question, and I know both of our organizations are striving very hard to increase access to residencies. We all know that this is a very expensive material to work with. Can you both talk about what the respective organizations are doing as far as trying to widen access?
Sure. I think when we first opened here, and you might have some words to add, residencies weren't a big part of what we were doing. I think we were trying to figure out exactly what we were trying to do in the hot shop that related to the exhibitions that were up, and for our general public to understand what glass was. So it was really more about understanding process and technique and seeing how things could be made. As we started the visiting artist program, you know, it started with invitation sort of only, and it was generated through curatorial. And as that started, so it was maybe once a month we'd have a visiting artist, and sometime, you know, it was somebody of note, and they would come here, and they'd usually bring a team, because they didn't know who we were and what we were capable of then, or, you know, or not capable of really. And so they showed up typically with a team, and, you know, we supplemented in that. And as we grew, the visiting artist program grew, and it was still many times it was through invitation, and sometimes it was connected to exhibitions, sometimes it was connected through a theme, Shortly thereafter, in 2004, reaching out to Pilchuck and starting this relationship. So you can see that evolution. And then there was a point where, like, okay, we need to start something else. So enter the application process. So the application process at the museum was pivotal in bringing new people in and making it accessible to folks who weren't thinking about glass. So and I know that we've tried very hard over the years to get the word out into different organizations so that people know about this as a resource. So that was one. And then we continue within Tacoma in our community here is, the Hilltop Artist Program is a huge resource in Tacoma, and I think even from the early days, we were linked to them and helping mentor some of the students and kids that moved through that program. So that, again, trying to foster an environment that, as they learned about hot glass as teenagers in high school, the few that wanted to really carry it on and move into the field came through here and hopefully found opportunities through that. And again, we're starting to work with different organizations within our community to open up that access to local artists here as well.
Yeah, I think, Pilchuck has many different programs, from, and, hundreds of students that come up there, so hundreds of opportunities or responsibilities to think about accessibility. And I think that the first step, and one that is long overdue, is just looking at the ways that you're sort of passively excluding people from the opportunity. So, partial scholarships or scholarships without travel or application fees. I mean, the first thing we did when I came on was get rid of all our application fees. How many people are not applying because they don't have the $45? That's like starting there, I mean, young artists, if they do that 4 times a month, that's a chunk of change that just applying for things. So that was the first step. Also, we've added a lot of residencies around the world, this partner residency program, which hasn't actually happened yet because nobody's moving around the world, but hopefully next year we have residencies in France and Belgium. All of that's included in that free application so they can apply for 5 or 6 things at once, basically. And also, obviously, hopefully making our application even more attractive if you can simultaneously apply for a, residency somewhere in the world. I think very few of our opportunities, this Artists in Residence program that comes through in the summer is curated by myself, so that they're part of that buzz that we were talking about earlier, so that the sort of sessions have a cohesiveness to them, or at least a conceptual framework to them. That being said, the vast majority of our opportunities are picked by external juries by design. So then you have to think about who's sitting on that jury and how they're making decisions and being very conscious about who you're putting in those sort of gateholder positions, making sure they're representative of communities that we might be overlooking, making sure that that they're conscious of these issues either beforehand or that we're making them aware that these are priorities for the school. So there's a lot of, those are all kind of basic steps before you even get into like increasing scholarship funding and looking at the economics of attending or practicing in school. I think one of the things, that we're really conscious of is that a Pilchuck experience can be life transforming. Those 2 weeks there can just both technically, life-wise, for better and for worse, people throw their keys in the pond and never, crazy stuff happens to people's lives, and that's great. But like, what is the mentorship after that? If somebody has this amazing opportunity, how do you build ladders with other organizations around the country? It's not all Pilchuck, but how can you build an ecosystem that supports artists making it across that gap, from wherever they're coming from, a challenged background or a like privileged college education? It's still hard to make that jump into being a practicing artist. So I think that is a role all of our organizations need to think about, and organizations like the Glass Art Society is being very active, trying to think about how you build that ecosystem to better support artists that don't come from the same privilege that many of us did in getting started, or at least a safety net that we knew we weren't going to fall out flat on our face, So.
Well, thank you. I want to be cognizant of our time because We are going to have a quick gallery tour after this conversation, but I did want to ask our audience here if anybody had a burning question you'd like to ask either one or both of the Bens here at the moment. We have somebody in the back there.
Yeah, I think that there's a huge perception that there is expertise necessary to get started. I think that's a huge stumbling block. People come, they see Ben's team working, and they're like, I could never do that, you know. So a lot of it is conceptual, but that is also in how we describe our programs. So for years and years, Pilchuck described itself as the best place to come in the world. Masters teaching masters. This is where you come when you are already the best. Well, that's was true. I mean, it was true, but it's not a very inclusive message to like growing the field, right? Like, oh well, I'm not the best, so I guess that's not the experience for me. So a lot of it's around messaging, around emphasizing the fact that people are. There's ways to use the material that require almost no technique. I mean, I've gone through this spectrum in my own work where I got heavily into the craft of, I mean, I spent a year trying to learn how to make goblets, and if you saw my work now, you would say, well, that was wasted time. But I've actually come down to, like, what's the stupidest way I can, or, like, you know, what, I walk around the studio and pick up glass off the floor. I know this guy does, too. You know, like, there's so much in the waste stream of this process that I found incredibly rich that anybody with an imaginative brain could come in and look at those pieces and be like, oh, maybe I could do this, or maybe I could melt this into a puddle, you know. And I think when you go into I think you'll see some of that in the show, actually. You know, there's like, even though they're made by these I'm sure there's things that, like, people come in and be like, can you make this teardrop? And you're like, yes, I can make those all day. But then, you know, the glass object in and of itself may not be that inspiring, but then when you see what the artist goes and does with it, it sort of transforms it. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I do think that that is a big obstacle. And another is just like knowledge. Like Pilchuck and the Museum of Glass are so well known within the glass field that already exists, but how do we, in these videos online, I can't tell you how many people have told me that same thing. Oh yeah, I was on the museum. You know, you type in Museum of Glass, and you guys are what shows up, and then you get into the video feed and start going down that wormhole. Especially if you're an artist already researching the material. So, but I do think we need to very consciously increase the entry points, and that's also academic programs. You know, they have a very passive recruitment. I have to say, to be a bit critical. Like most of the glass programs around the country. You know, when we come to them and and say, hey, can you send us a more diverse student pool? Do you have, you know, largely their response is, well, we get the students we get from the university. So I think that the whole ecosystem has to really look at where we can increase entry points into the activity.
Yep. I mean,
there's something I think a lot about. I think it's like in this day and age, is one of the primary. We both have this like very strange vantage point on the field, in that we get a lot of applications. We see who's working. We have sort of a sort of top-down view of what's going on, and I think that right now, critically, we just need to increase the base that's like feeding this whole ecosystem and always make it more interesting, you know.
And just to add to that, my entry into the glass world and art wasn't maybe a traditional way. I started blowing glass when I was a teenager as a job, and it was just something that had intrigued me after school, kind of leaning on the door, and was given an opportunity at some point, and I started off at the very low end of sweeping the floor and making coffee, and started making glass, and that's how I started in this field, and then ended up coming from the background that I did was able to go to art school, which wasn't on my radar at all. So it changed my path completely. And then seeing the time that I was in school and my work ethic upon graduating, I always, I wanted a job. So I worked basically in a factory in California before finding this opportunity up here. And through all those times, the people that I worked with, either in school, didn't come from the way that the path that I had taken. But as I worked in more studios, that was more common. So like, how did you come to blowing glass? There was a shop in their hometown. They thought it was cool. It was decent wage. It was hard work. And for people that are interested in that. So that is sort of one entry for people to start working with the material. But if you're an artist and you're looking to get into glass, I think that's where the passive recruitment of universities, that's huge. But here in town, again, the Hilltop Artist Program is bringing youth into the program through in the school system and basically in middle school. And I think finding ways to work with them and give them the opportunity to continue on if they so choose is a great entry point. But I think it is difficult, and I think that many institutions like Pilchuck and the Museum of Glass were re-examining how can we get the word out, and how can we create those opportunities.
Yeah, and we can't do it all ourselves. There is this proliferation of tremendous youth programs around the country, in Newark, Chicago, New Orleans, that are all sort of taking different angles at this. I mean, the Project Fire in Chicago is sort of an amazing example of like specifically working with gun violence trauma. So the trauma that surrounds gun violence, gun victims in Chicago, which unfortunately, there's no shortage of clients for their program these days. But like really, I think that Glass, does have an artistic output, obviously, but there are people doing amazing work working with veterans. The Hot Shop Heroes program that Patty D and folks started here. I think, and you were probably involved in that as well. Yeah. I think that people are just beginning to sort of like figure out what this like really intensive, but also very diverse, different sort of hand activities, different motor activities, like just beginning to chip away at the iceberg of what's actually possible with this material as a learning vehicle, regardless of what the output is. I think that there's a real richness to the process, and the process of making with your hands, which is not a new idea, that you enter different brain space, and that can be really powerful place for healing for a lot of people. So I think for organizations like us, it's how do we support the work that those organizations are doing? How do we provide ladders for the graduate? Most of these are youth programs, so one of the critical issues is that people age out of those programs, and they come from this. Hilltop is a great example. They have more glass access than probably most of us professional artists have to the material, and then suddenly they've graduated, and so making sure that this is one of the few areas in the world where there's enough density of glass activity to actually support young artists coming out of these type of programs. So making sure that there's jobs, that there's the support that needs to give them the boost that everybody needs.
We are almost out of time. We do have a scheduled tour at noon, so I think we'll move ourselves over to the galleries. Just before we go, another quick reminder that there will be a series of conversations on Zoom with the artists in the exhibitions, and that will be on Thursdays, as I said, at noon, starting October 21st. And it's called What Are You Talking About? So we hope you'll join us for that. And so now, shall we go over, and will you perhaps lead us in a quick tour of the actual artwork?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.